So this got brought up the other day in a live stream on the True Crime Talk show, where we were kind of talking about time of death and how that's determined. And I can't remember exactly how it got brought up, but I decided I wanted to dive into it because that's an aspect of the investigation we haven't dug into, and determining time of death physically, not just with like, phones and app data and cameras, like, that were nearby. And because,
Yeah, I think we were talking specifically about bodies, right?
well,
And the ability.
we were talking about, what I think we were talking about is how the timeline of the case has changed so much. And the fact that we got this general range of time from like, I think it was like anywhere from 2 a.m. to like 5 a.m. And then they narrowed it down from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. And then it changed to like 4. Yeah. Or maybe it was like 3 to 4 and then 4. And then more specifically like 4:20 or something like that. I can't remember the exact time right now, but it made me question, like, especially with the rumors we have heard that it was hot in the house, that the front door was open at 8:30 a.m. It makes me question the condition of the bodies and how, if they handled this crime scene right, did they take the proper steps to determine time of death at scene as soon as possible? Because if you, and the coroner got there super late too, so it makes me question, was there a pathologist there? Was there a medical examiner there? Was there anybody there who could determine the time of death? Since Mabbutt was hours late.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's important when, like, literally within 30 minutes after passing away, things start to set in. Yeah. Things start to change. Mm-hmm. And
like liver temperature, internal temperature,
all
rigor
kinds
mortis,
of things.
All those other mortises we've looked up with like the blood pooling and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, which is what I wanted to dig into a little bit, is like, how do they determine a time of death?
Yeah, that's good.
And it's important because these things, they get to a point, if it's gone too long, it gets harder and harder and harder to estimate that time of death, and the conditions of the scene can make it harder to determine that death. Now, we don't have to worry about water or anything like that, because water is one thing that makes it much, much harder. Fire is one that makes it much, much harder.
Moisture in the air.
Yeah, moisture in the air, sure, yeah. So some of the things they use to estimate time of death is body temperature, rigor mortis, liver mortis, degree of putrefaction, stomach contents, corneal cloudiness, so that's the eyes, vitreous potassium levels, insect activity, which is entomology, and scene markers.
Okay.
That's just some of the things.
What's a scene marker?
I'm assuming things around the scene.
Oh, okay.
Like things like gathered through the investigation.
Like a phone that was last touched at, you know what I mean? Okay, got it.
Yep. So I specifically started looking at like the stages.
The ones that could apply, essentially.
Yeah. And there are. So let me say, there is a deeper dive into this with some new technologies that I found, but I can't quite comprehend them yet. Like, that's something I'm going to have to really go into and look really deep into, because all I can find is like studies, like actual papers written on it by scientists. And that's hard to understand. It's not written in layman terms. Yeah. It's written from a perspective of a scientist, like a doctor who understands all of that kind of language that has to do with medical terminology and, science-y tech, like terminology. And it's hard to understand. But I did find other things other than what I just listed, which basically the body temperature, especially I think in this kind of situation we're talking about here, which is within, say the crimes happen between 3 to 4, they get there at noon. That gives them what, like 8 hours, 9, and maybe 9 if they need everybody to get there within an hour to, so like about 8 to 10 hours. And that is about the time where that might start not being accurate anymore.
Okay.
So that's concerning, but that's like that, those kinds of things need to be done as soon as possible, especially body temperature. Because here's one thing I didn't know. If the body starts cooling and say it is hot, like you said it was in there, because the body's getting cooler, it's going to start taking on the temperature of the room. And if it's hot in there, you have such a little margin.
Yeah, but that could also
say it's 80 degrees in there.
Yeah.
And the body's temperature is 98.5. The body temperature decreases by 1.5 degrees per hour.
Okay.
1.5 per hour. I don't know what that comes to, but that doesn't sound like they have much more than that doesn't sound like they have 10 hours.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, yes. And when you said that the body would start taking on like the temperature of the room or whatever, that's still a giant gap. Like even if it was 80 in there, 80 is considered really hot. You know, you'd see a ton of steam coming out of the house. Like I theorized with that news, whatever broadcast that I found that I still need to find. But there's still a huge like 18-degree gap there.
Yeah, but you also have to determine the fact that, okay, so apparently bodies that have more fat or more clothes lose temperature more slowly. Now, thinner people and people wearing less clothes are going to lose it faster. And these were thin young women.
They were.
And they were in bed, which the bed may help insulate the body a little. But how much clothes were they wearing? They were going to bed. Like, were they bundled up? Were they in a t-shirt?
Well, if they were as damaged as we believe they were, wouldn't that change things?
It could, and
because
also
blood
coming
out, not staying in.
It could also make the body cool down faster.
Man, and so if it's colder inside, let's say they kept their house at like 55, right? Then wouldn't they cool quicker?
If they kept it at what?
Like 55.
Oh, yeah. So like the actual temperature of the environment matters a lot with that too.
Gosh, so many factors.
There are a ton of factors.
I wonder if they have a rough computer program, right? Because we have AI and things like that. Could you take the body? Could you just take the internal temperature, the temperature of the liver, and then punch in their body fat percentage, their weight, their height, their general measurements, and then could that spit out an estimated average? You know what I mean?
So what I did find is there's something called Hensig's nonogram, and it is considered the most accurate method of measuring the time of death by means of temperature measurement. So it's basically they determine the time of death using temperature. It also mentions the Glaster equation, which I don't know what that is. But it sounds like they do similar things. It's just, yeah, you can look it up real quick. But it takes into consideration other factors, and it's like kind of computing that. So what it takes into account is the body temperature, which they take rectally at the time. It should be as soon as possible. The ambient temperature, the body weight, the clothing, where the body was in air or water. And then there are these graphs where they chart it out.
Oh,
And this is
wow. Okay.
considered the most accurate way to determine a time of death
Oh.
using body temperature.
Okay. That's interesting.
And body temperature is considered the most accurate way, if the conditions are right, to determine a time of death.
Okay. That's interesting.
And it's in that window of time where I don't know if they could have just used body temperature. It would really depend on the environment of the scene, of how hot it was in there.
Yeah,
Or
I think that
cold.
could change things, or an unreliable temperature too, because you got to remember, part of my issue with the investigation at first is the fact that they got there and opened up all the doors and windows.
Yeah, you're right.
So now you're going to have like really hot, maybe, to cold, to, you know what I mean? You're drastically changing these things. That's why I've said from the very beginning, there's no way it's not best to lock everything down and turn off the heater. Just like turn off all central AC and heat and close everything.
Right. But also what's important to mention is that there's different times of death. And I think that's important. So there's a physiological time of death, which is when your body shuts down. And then there's a legal time of death, which is like when the coroner shows up and says, this person is dead, and puts it on your death certificate. And then there's the estimated time of death, which is all the clues they find throughout an investigation to determine a time of death. But you never really get a physiological time of death unless you are in a perfect circumstance where you have a doctor there and they're watching the person die. That's the only way you can get like a perfect physiological death. Anything other than that is an estimated time of death, and that is calculated and estimated. It's from everything I've seen, it's a pretty rough estimate. And I saw somebody argue before a while back that they can get it down to 30 minutes. Like, they absolutely know what time this crime happened based off of the bodies and the autopsies. I don't agree. I think they could maybe get it down to an hour.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I think there's some like cellular technologies
where
they look really small down at the cells, and that gives them a better understanding.
I did find some stuff like that, but like I said, that's the stuff that's super hard to understand. That's going to have to be dug into more, because I found a paper that started diving into stuff like that. But dude,
cellular degeneration or whatever.
So here's one: biochemical assessment. The biochemical blood assessment is non-significant in the immediate postmortem phase due to the lack of cellular death. On the other hand, cellular death makes biochemical blood assessment in the early phase extremely difficult. Also, there's redistribution. Jeez. Of electrolytes from the cells into the plasma and serum, resulting in varying changes in the levels of these electrolytes. These variations and their implications are studied in the emerging field of thanatochemistry. The biochemical assessment has been useful for estimating PMI, which is basically time of death, from vitreous humor synovial fluid, pericardial fluid, urine, cerebrospinal fluid. Numerous factors, however, need to be accounted for when examining the time of death based on biochemistry, including but not limited to age, gender. So basically all those things, cause of death, other intrinsic and extrinsic factors. Only a few biochemical markers out of 388 were found to have had sufficient investigation with these considerations, namely potassium, sodium, urea, as well as chloride, magnesium, hypoxanthine, and cardiac troponin T. So basically, they could look at these like electrolytes and things, and they're considered biochemical markers, being judged to have had suitable research for use. 6 were found to be suitably researched but not suitable for practical use. 18 were found to have been poorly investigated and not suitable for application. Like, it's super complicated.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like it.
And then there's various other like supravital reactions, aerobic respiration.
I wish there was a way to get it down though, because like, dude, you're dead once your heart stops.
There's also a molecular assessment that has to do with DNA. Yeah.
That's interesting.
But this one again this one was even harder for me to understand. The analysis showed RNA degeneration was time dependent for the entire 11 hours, although no statistical significance was demonstrable for the first 4 hours. Researchers selected 11 genes for quantitative PCR analysis, while RNA in the heart was found to be the most stable. It showed no correlation with PMI. 6 genes were found to correlate with the time of death, 4 in the femoral quadriceps, and 2 genes in the liver. So, and then they made mathematical models to use this to like determine, I guess, the time of death. An error means a 51.4 minutes. So I'm guessing that's the range they can determine it in, is 51.4 minutes in that particular study.
So essentially an hour.
Yeah. And it's talking about proteins like that. I'm just mentioning that to let you know it's there, but I don't understand it. And I'm sure you didn't understand much of it. So that's why I went back to the basics, so I can understand that to be able to understand the more complicated things, which I may be able to do a part 2 on, because those are interesting, because they seem like if they would work, if you could look at cells and if that, I don't know why that makes me feel like that could potentially be more accurate, but maybe it's not.
I mean,
I don't know.
I guess it just depends on how quickly things start deteriorating.
Oh, and they start quick because literally cells in your body start to burst.
Okay, well,
like
I
it's
feel like
crazy.
You should be able to take like a rough estimated drop of blood and see cells bursting and stuff. So
a few things I found interesting. I did go into the mortises, like rigor mortis, liver mortis, algor mortis, and how they're used to determine a time of death, and they're interesting. So one that I found really, really interesting, especially after looking at that interview from the Gonzalez family, is that Haley was supposedly sitting up, trapped up against a wall, right?
Yeah.
Well, liver mortis is when you have pooling of the blood in certain areas, right?
Yep.
So everything stops, your heart's not pumping, so blood starts to pool to wherever the most gravity is.
Yep.
And then as it pools, if you're laying on something in those lower points, like say, like I saw a picture of a lady who died on a park bench and she was laying on her back. Well, she had the complete pattern in her back, and those are pressure points. Well, say somebody came and moved her and laid her face down on the ground. They could see, okay, well, she was laying on that park bench because all the lividity is in her back, and she has that pattern.
Mm-hmm.
That starts setting in like within 30 minutes.
Wow.
Like, and it looks like bruising. So I know that, okay, so from what I saw, they say it starts in 2 hours, but I literally just listened to a coroner say it can happen in 30 minutes. It can start beginning then. So a lot of it is in a perfect world, like this is how it typically happens. But again, there's things that can speed this up or slow it down.
In like a controlled situation. This is the perfect world situation, but yeah.
Yeah. So it typically begins in 2 hours and is permanent in 8 hours.
Okay.
So by the time the dispatch gets there, it's permanent.
Jeez.
So, but they could also see, like, they could also see if she was probably moved.
Oh, yeah. I think so. We've talked about that before already, because remember, like, one of the theories that was out there for a while is that underground fight club situation thing, and the fact that they would be able to see the livor mortis details if somebody was moved, because it would be pooling on however they were being carried. Like, they would see that. You could see that.
And hotter temperatures make it happen faster, and colder temperatures make it happen slower.
Interesting.
Yeah. Which is
because
how it works
colder
with all
temperatures ruin evidence in a crime scene quicker.
Cold?
Yeah.
Yeah, but
From
hot.
everything I read. So hot ruins the body quicker, and cold ruins evidence in the crime scene quicker.
Like what?
Like fingerprints, like DNA evidence, like anything that could tie a suspect to a crime scene.
Oh. Interesting.
Yep.
I didn't know that about the DNA. But then there's rigor mortis, of course, which is the stiffness. It's temporary. And it starts also about 2 hours in, but again is affected by hot or cold temperatures. So I have a chart here. No visible signs of rigor mortis means less than 2 hours or more than 36 hours. So if you come across a body and there's no rigor mortis, that means they've been dead less than 2 or more than 36. It begins in the head and the neck, and then that's over 2 hours, okay, when it's supposed to be beginning. And then it's everywhere with it. So 12 hours is when it's everywhere and the body is as rigorous as it could be. 13 to 24 hours, it starts disappearing. It's in the legs, but not in the head and neck anymore. Between 24 to 26 hours, stiffness disappears 24 to 36 hours. So that 8-hour time gap would make it still progressing. Like it's still increasing.
Okay.
And then there's algor mortis, which is what they call the most accurate estimated way to estimate time of death, which is temperature. It's the loss of the temperature, which we just went over pretty extensively. So what I found interesting was all of that being used to calculate, like, so while all of these don't seem that accurate, it seems that all of them put together could narrow you down more and more. But you know what's even more interesting?
What?
They can use stomach contents to determine time of death. And how, like, because, you know, there's a certain amount of time it takes to empty from your stomach.
Yeah.
They ate.
Someone was just leaving a comment talking about that.
They got food at the food truck. They were out drinking that night. They went home and ate their food. And we know that's what it's determined on. We need to know what time they ate the food to be able to determine time of death using the food in their body.
Oh, yeah.
So
I think it was Greg.
knowing they got food and went home and ate it narrows that down a lot. Their stomachs, so it was what time when they were at the food truck?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
They were all back home by 1:45.
Or yeah, you're right. So
or 1:55.
Yeah.
So let's say they ate food at 2:00 and were murdered at 4. Then I believe either their stomach should be almost empty. Doesn't it take like 3 hours? I'm pretty sure it was like 3 hours for it to empty into the large colon.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, but I would think they would be able to track it down even more than that. No? Like to minutes?
I don't know about minutes. After a meal, it normally takes 1.5 hours to 2 hours for food to move out of the stomach into the small intestine.
Interesting.
So that gives them 1.5 to 2 hours. It is interesting.
So that's 30 minutes. 1.5 to 2 hours should be able to give them a breakdown to 30 minutes if it's in that area. Or if it's not, is there still a way to determine based on how close it would be to getting dumped into the large intestine? Or,
if it was still in their stomach, that would mean it most likely happened at 3, not 4. If it's at 4, then it should be further down in the intestines.
Yeah.
Because this has to vary quite a bit because, like, it's saying it's all the way in the small intestine. That means you should be, like, going to the bathroom every, 3 to 4 hours, after eating. And that's not realistic. Most people don't do that. I don't know. I'm just thinking about that. It's kind of weird, but that's what it says. But I was just thinking, I saw the food contents used in the JonBenet Ramsey case. She still had pineapple in her stomach, or fruit and veg mix. They didn't actually say pineapple. They said, it was a mixture of some kind of fruit and veg thing. Because everybody kept saying pineapple, but I read the thing, and it said fruit veg mix. It didn't just say pineapple.
Interesting.
But it makes me curious because that is something we actually have, that they should have, that they should take into account, is that they just ate and went to bed.
So if they could identify when it was paid for, then you could rough estimate the time of eating, right? Whether they brought it back with them or ate on site. That could help determine it down to a minute.
They didn't eat on site.
I was just meaning in general, that could determine it down to minutes, right? Then you just take that and track it through the stomach. Yeah, that's interesting. That is very interesting.
It is. But we've been talking about these issues in the timeline. I'm curious if that's something I want to see the autopsy report.
Yeah,
I want to know that stuff. I want to know if they looked for that stuff, because that would help determine if it happened closer to this time or that time. Now, again, it's all estimations. It is. I'm going to look more into the cellular level stuff and the DNA stuff to see if there's anything there. From those studies, they didn't really sell it to me. What I read to you guys, it kind of sounded like they weren't sure if it worked.
Really?
Didn't you get that impression?
I don't know.
I'm going to look more into it because I'm really curious about it.
Science is never concrete. That's one thing that we've been able to find out through all of these videos we've done is no science is concrete. Nothing. It doesn't exist.
That's true.
Nothing in the world is concrete.
That's true.
It's always changing.
Yeah.
So okay, it's not concrete, but how accurate have you seen it be before? And how many times do you get accurate results like that versus how many times is it dude, this can't be. This is way off.
Do you want to know what I'm concerned about?
What?
is the fact that because these calculations that they use to determine time of death are so, they can vary so much based off of random things in the environment, and they take into account what the investigators are finding on the scene to help make those determinations and narrow things down. They don't just use the physical objective evidence. They look at scene markers. They look at what's going on in the scene. Like if they have cell phone evidence of Xana being on TikTok at 4, if they have a video of audio, of distorted audio where it sounds like a crime could possibly be happening, and they have the investigators in there with them doing the autopsy and determining the time of death,
Yeah, that shouldn't happen.
it could be influenced. Yeah, but they say it's vital. Coroners, medical examiners, pathologists, they all say it's vital in determining these things.
Yeah, and I say that it should be objective. Like in a case in a science case, this scientist should come up with their number. This scientist separately should come up with their number. You know, the police should do the investigation to come up with their number, and then you just compare notes and like, okay, this one probably is the most likely, so we'll go with
what
that
I
for
think?
the official number.
What I think should happen is you should have somebody doing an autopsy who is doing it completely blind, doesn't know who the person is, doesn't know what happened to them, and is only finding the objective findings. And they are done then. They write their report, they're done. Then you have another person come in who examines what they did, and they also take into account the investigators' information and give their estimate. And then you can have it checked again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree.
Like, I think that separating those two,
science testing comparison, yes.
and then have someone separate compare it to the actual investigation and what was at the crime scene.
Yep. I agree. I agree.
But I don't know. I'm not a coroner. I am not a professional at that. That's just my idea. But I want to know what you guys think. If you learned anything, if it was boring, I don't know. Should I not dig deeper into the time of death? Should I? I'm super curious about those sciences, so I'll probably do it on my own time anyway. But if you guys want to hear about it, definitely let me know. And let me know what you think about what we learned here. And if you have anything to add to this, if you know anything about how time of death is determined that's maybe more advanced, or another thing from the scene you can recall that you think could be added into this to help determine the time of death, I would be really curious and thankful to hear those opinions and ideas. And that's it.